there is a quiet comfort in knowing that empires rise and fall, that centuries pass, and that time moves forward whether we watch it or not. Rome lasted longer than most of us can imagine. From the first emperor to the last, the story stretches across 500 years. Generations came and went. Borders shifted. Languages changed. But the title remained. This is a timeline of every Roman emperor. Not a collection of battles or political intrigue, but a slow walk through the names and reigns that shaped an empire. Some ruled for decades. Others barely held power for a few months. Each one played a part in something larger than themselves. You don't need to remember every detail. You don't need to take notes. This is simply a chance to listen, to let the names wash over you, and to feel the weight of all that time. Rome began as a republic. For centuries it was governed by senators and consuls, by laws and traditions meant to prevent any one person from holding too much power. But systems change. Ambition grows. And in the final decades of the Republic, the old order began to crack. Civil wars tore through the Roman world. Generals commanded armies loyal to them, not to the state. Alliances formed and dissolved. Blood was spilled in the forum and on distant battlefields alike. Out of that chaos came one man who would reshape everything. His name was Octavian, though history would remember him by another title. He did not call himself king. He did not overthrow the Republic in a single violent act. Instead, he quietly gathered power, piece by piece, until he stood alone. In the year 27 BC, the Senate granted him a new name, Augustus. It meant the revered one. It carried weight without the danger of older titles. And with that name, the Roman Empire truly began. Augustus would rule for more than 40 years. He set the template for all who followed. He showed that one person could hold the empire together, could command its armies, could speak for its people. He also showed how fragile that power could be, how much depended on the will of soldiers and the loyalty of those closest to the throne. After Augustus, the title passed from hand to hand. Sometimes it went to a son, sometimes to an adopted heir, sometimes it was seized by force. The empire grew vast, stretching from the cold forests of Britain to the deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the rivers of Mesopotamia. But size brought complexity. Distance brought rebellion, and the question of succession was never truly solved. Some emperors are remembered as wise and just, others as cruel or mad. Many are barely remembered at all, but each one held the same title. Each one wore the purple. Each one, for a time, was Rome. This is Archive of Rest, and tonight we walk through the long, unbroken line of emperors who ruled the Roman world. We begin with Augustus. We end with the fall of the West. In between, there are names you may recognize and names you have never heard. There are long reigns and short ones. There are moments of glory and moments of collapse. But through it all, there is continuity. There is the slow, steady passage of time. And there is the knowledge that even the mightiest empire is, in the end, just a collection of human lives. So settle in. Let the story unfold. And if you drift off along the way, that's perfectly fine. Rome will still be here when you return. Augustus did not inherit an empire. He built one from the ruins of a republic that had torn itself apart. His original name was Gaius Octavius. He was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar, a young man with no military reputation and no obvious claim to power. But when Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, everything changed. Caesar's will named Octavian as his adopted son and heir. It was a dangerous inheritance. Rome was fractured. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, controlled much of the military. The Senate feared another dictator. And across the Mediterranean, enemies waited for Rome to collapse entirely. Octavian was 18 years old. What followed were years of alliance and betrayal. Octavian joined forces with Mark Antony and another general, Lepidus, forming what history calls the Second Triumvirate. Together, they hunted down Caesar's assassins. They divided the Roman world among themselves, and then inevitably they turned on each other. Lepidus was pushed aside. Antony allied himself with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, and ruled the eastern provinces as if they were his own kingdom. Octavian remained in Rome, slowly building support, presenting himself as the defender of Roman tradition. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Octavian's fleet defeated Antony and Cleopatra. The couple fled to Egypt, where they both took their own lives. Octavian stood alone. He returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. He claimed he was giving power back to the Senate, back to the people. In truth, he kept control of the armies, the provinces, and the treasury. But he did it quietly. He did it with respect for old forms and old names. In 27 BC, the Senate gave him the title Augustus. He became the first emperor, though he never used that word. He called himself Princeps, the first citizen. It was a careful fiction, and it worked. Augustus ruled for 41 years. He reformed the army, making it a professional force loyal to the emperor. He rebuilt Rome's infrastructure, famously claiming he found the city brick and left it marble. He established a system of succession, though it would prove fragile. And he brought a kind of peace to the Roman world that it had not known in generations. He married Livia, a woman of intelligence and ambition. Together they navigated the complexities of power. Augustus had no sons of his own, so he adopted heirs. Some died young, others disappointed him. In the end, the succession fell to Tiberius, Livia's son from a previous marriage. Augustus died in AD 14, at the age of 75. He had ruled longer than most emperors who followed him. He had set the pattern, and he had shown that one man could hold an empire together if he was careful, if he was patient, and if he was willing to let others believe they still had a voice. Tiberius became emperor reluctantly. He was 55 years old, a skilled general, and a man who seemed to have little love for the role he inherited. He had spent much of his life in Augustus's shadow. He had been married off for political reasons, forced to divorce a woman he loved to marry Augustus's daughter, Julia. He had won victories on the frontier, securing the empire's northern borders. But he had never been Augustus's first choice. He was the last option, the one who survived when others did not. Tiberius ruled for 23 years. The early part of his reign was competent, even stable. He respected the Senate, at least in form. He managed the empire's finances carefully. He avoided unnecessary wars. But Tiberius was not a man who enjoyed public life. He was suspicious, withdrawn, and increasingly bitter. In AD 26, he left Rome entirely and retired to the island of Capri. He would never return to the capital. From Capri, he ruled through letters and intermediaries. Power in Rome fell to others, most notably Sejanus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus used his position to eliminate rivals, to spread fear, and to consolidate his own influence. For a time, it seemed he might even succeed Tiberius. But Tiberius was not blind. In AD 31, he had Sejanus arrested and executed. The purge that followed was brutal. Senators, officials, and anyone connected to Sejanus were killed or exiled. Tiberius died in AD 37, at the age of 77. Some said he was smothered. Others said he died of natural causes. Either way, few mourned him. He had kept the empire stable, but he had done so without warmth, without connection, and without the careful public image that Augustus had maintained. The next emperor was Gaius, better known by his nickname, Caligula. It meant little boots, a name given to him as a child when he wore miniature soldier's sandals around the military camps where his father commanded. Caligula was 24 when he became emperor. He was the great-grandson of Augustus, the son of a popular general, and the nephew of Tiberius. Rome welcomed him with genuine hope. After the grim final years of Tiberius, the people wanted someone young, someone energetic, someone who might restore a sense of joy to the empire. For a few months, Caligula seemed to deliver. He held games, gave bonuses to the soldiers, and recalled those who had been exiled under Tiberius. He appeared generous and approachable, but something changed. Some ancient sources say he fell ill and was never the same. Others suggest the power itself corrupted him. Whatever the cause, Caligula's behavior became erratic, cruel, and increasingly bizarre. He declared himself a living god. He demanded worship. He humiliated senators, forcing them to run beside his chariot or to serve him at banquets. He spent vast sums on spectacles and building projects, draining the treasury that Tiberius had carefully managed. Stories from his reign are difficult to verify. Some are likely exaggerations, but the pattern is clear. Caligula ruled without restraint, without respect for tradition, and without concern for the consequences. He lasted less than 4 years. In AD 41, members of the Praetorian Guard assassinated him in a palace corridor. His wife and infant daughter were killed as well. The Julio-Claudian line seemed on the verge of ending, but the Praetorians were not ready to give up the empire. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. Claudius was 50 years old, a man who had spent his life in the background. He had a limp, a stammer, and a reputation for being bookish and awkward. No one had ever considered him a threat, which is likely why he had survived. The Praetorians declared him emperor. The Senate, caught off guard, had little choice but to accept. Claudius ruled for 13 years, and he proved far more capable than anyone expected. He was intelligent, well-read, and genuinely interested in governance. He expanded the empire, adding Britain as a province in AD 43. He improved Rome's infrastructure, building aqueducts and expanding the harbor at Ostia. He reformed the bureaucracy, relying on freedmen to manage the day-to-day administration of the empire. But Claudius was not a strong personality. He was easily influenced, particularly by the women in his life. His third wife, Messalina, was notorious for her scandals and her manipulation of power. When she went too far, plotting against Claudius himself, she was executed. Claudius then married his niece, Agrippina the Younger. She was ambitious, ruthless, and determined to see her son, Nero, become emperor. She convinced Claudius to adopt Nero and name him as heir, bypassing Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. In AD 54, Claudius died suddenly. Most historians believe Agrippina poisoned him. Nero, at the age of 16, became emperor. Nero's reign began with promise. He was young, charming, and guided by capable advisors, including the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. For the first 5 years, the empire was well managed. Nero showed interest in the arts, in public works, and in maintaining peace. But Nero was also vain, impulsive, and increasingly unwilling to be controlled. He resented his mother's influence and eventually had her murdered in AD 59. He divorced and executed his first wife, Octavia, to marry his mistress, Poppaea. He performed publicly as a musician and actor, something no emperor had done before, and something many Romans found deeply undignified. In AD 64, a great fire swept through Rome, destroying much of the city. Rumors spread that Nero had started the fire to clear space for a new palace. Whether true or not, Nero needed a scapegoat. He blamed the Christians, a small and unpopular religious group, and launched the first major persecution against them. Nero rebuilt Rome on a grand scale, including his enormous Golden House, a sprawling palace complex that consumed vast amounts of public land. The cost was staggering, and Nero resorted to confiscations, debasement of the currency, and heavy taxation to pay for it. By AD 68, the empire had had enough. Revolts broke out in Gaul and Spain. The Senate declared Nero a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him. Nero fled Rome and, with enemies closing in, took his own life. His last words, according to legend, were, "What an artist dies in me." He was 30 years old. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome for nearly a century, was over. When Nero died, there was no clear successor, no adopted heir, no son waiting in the wings. For the first time since Augustus, the imperial throne was truly open. What followed was chaos. The year AD 69 is remembered as the year of the 4 emperors. It was a year of civil war, of armies marching on Rome, of legions declaring their own commanders as emperor. It revealed a truth that Augustus had tried to hide. The emperor's power came not from law or tradition, but from the loyalty of soldiers. The first to claim the throne was Servius Sulpicius Galba. He was the governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, one of the Spanish provinces, and he was 73 years old when the Senate declared him emperor. Galba was a man of the old Roman aristocracy. He believed in discipline, in austerity, in the values of the Republic. He marched to Rome with the support of his legions and the promise of restoring order. But Galba made mistakes quickly. He refused to pay the bonuses that soldiers expected when a new emperor took power. He was harsh, inflexible, and seemed out of touch with the realities of ruling an empire that had grown used to spectacle and generosity. Within months, support for Galba crumbled. The Praetorian Guard, angry at being passed over for rewards, turned against him. So did the legions on the Rhine, who declared their own commander, Vitellius, as emperor. In Rome, another man saw an opportunity. His name was Marcus Salvius Otho. He had once been a friend of Nero, even married to the woman who would become Nero's wife, Poppaea. Otho had supported Galba's rise, expecting to be named heir. When Galba chose someone else, Otho acted. On January 15, AD 69, the Praetorian Guard murdered Galba in the Roman Forum. He had ruled for 7 months. Otho was declared emperor in his place. Otho was a different kind of ruler. He was younger, more charismatic, and more willing to spend money to secure loyalty. He tried to stabilize Rome, to win over the Senate, and to prepare for the inevitable conflict with Vitellius, whose legions were already marching south from Germany. The two armies met in northern Italy in April of AD 69. Otho's forces were defeated at the Battle of Bedriacum. Rather than prolong the civil war, Otho chose to take his own life. He had ruled for 3 months. He left behind a letter urging his supporters to accept Vitellius and spare Rome further bloodshed. It was a surprisingly selfless act from a man who had seized power through violence. Vitellius became the third emperor of the year. He was a career politician, the son of a powerful family, and a man who had spent much of his life in comfortable obscurity. He had been sent to command the legions in Germany, and when those legions declared him emperor, he accepted. Vitellius entered Rome in the summer of AD 69. He was greeted with celebrations, with promises of stability, with the hope that the civil war was finally over. But Vitellius was not a strong leader. He was indulgent, more interested in feasts and entertainment than in governance. He filled his administration with loyalists from the German legions, alienating the rest of the empire. And he failed to recognize that another threat was rising in the east. The legions in Judea, Egypt, and Syria had declared their own candidate, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known to history as Vespasian. He was a general of common birth, a man who had risen through merit rather than aristocratic connections. He had been leading the campaign to suppress the Jewish revolt in Judea, and his legions were battle-hardened and loyal. Vespasian's forces moved quickly. They secured Egypt, cutting off Rome's grain supply. They marched through the Balkans, and by late AD 69 they were approaching Italy. Vitellius tried to organize a defense, but his support collapsed. In December, Vespasian's troops entered Rome. There was fighting in the streets. The capital burned. And Vitellius, abandoned by his guards, was dragged from hiding and killed by a mob. He had ruled for 8 months. Vespasian, still in the east, was declared emperor by the Senate. The year of the 4 emperors was over. The Flavian dynasty had begun. Vespasian brought something Rome had not seen in a long time: stability born of competence rather than bloodline. He was not a descendant of Augustus. He was not from one of the great patrician families. His father had been a tax collector. His family came from the Italian countryside, far from the marble halls of the Roman elite. But Vespasian had spent decades in military service, governing provinces, and proving himself capable. When he finally entered Rome in AD 70, he was 60 years old. He had survived the chaos of the civil war not through luck, but through careful planning and the loyalty of his legions. And he understood that the empire needed more than another charismatic ruler. It needed someone who could rebuild. The treasury was empty. Nero's extravagance in the civil war had drained Rome's finances. Vespasian set about restoring them with a practicality that some found undignified. He raised taxes. He sold offices and titles. He even imposed a tax on public urinals, famously telling his son, when questioned about it, that money has no smell. But he also invested in Rome itself. He began construction of the Flavian amphitheater, the massive structure that would later be known as the Colosseum. He rebuilt temples and public buildings damaged in the Civil War. He reformed the Senate, bringing in new families from the provinces, men who owed their positions to merit rather than ancient lineage. Vespasian ruled for 10 years. He was practical, occasionally crude, and refreshingly straightforward. He did not pretend to be a god. He did not surround himself with excessive ceremony. On his deathbed in AD 79, his last words were reportedly a joke. "Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god." He died of natural causes, something that was becoming increasingly rare for Roman emperors. And for the first time since Augustus, power passed smoothly from father to son. Titus had been groomed for the role. He had commanded legions alongside his father. He had overseen the final siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, ending the Jewish revolt and bringing back enough plunder to fund the construction of the Colosseum. He was popular with the army, respected by the Senate, and seen as a capable administrator. Titus became emperor at the age of 39. His reign would be short, but it would be remembered. In AD 79, just months after Titus took power, Mount Vesuvius erupted. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried under ash and stone. Thousands died. Titus responded quickly, sending aid, visiting the disaster sites personally, and using imperial funds to help survivors rebuild. The following year, a fire swept through Rome, destroying large sections of the city. Again, Titus responded with relief efforts and reconstruction. Then came a plague, spreading through the capital and the surrounding regions. Titus managed each crisis with competence and compassion. He was generous, accessible, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of his people. The Romans, who had grown cynical about their emperors, began to see him as something different. They called him the delight of the human race, but Titus did not live long enough to build on that reputation. In AD 81, he fell ill with a fever. He died in September of that year at the age of 41. He had ruled for just over 2 years. Some whispered that his younger brother Domitian had poisoned him. There was no proof, but the suspicion lingered. Domitian became emperor immediately. He was 30 years old, and he had spent much of his life in the shadow of his father and brother. He had been given minor roles, kept away from real power, and largely ignored. Now, suddenly, the empire was his. Domitian's reign began well enough. He continued his father's building projects. He strengthened the empire's borders, campaigning in Germany and Britain. He was efficient, detail-oriented, and determined to prove himself. But Domitian was also paranoid. He trusted no one. He saw conspiracies everywhere. And as the years passed, his rule became increasingly autocratic. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He purged the Senate of anyone he suspected of disloyalty. He relied heavily on informers, creating an atmosphere of fear in Rome. Treason trials became common. Executions followed. Domitian ruled for 15 years, and by the end he had alienated nearly everyone. The Senate hated him. The aristocracy feared him. Even his own household had turned against him. In AD 96, a group of conspirators, including members of his own court, assassinated Domitian in his bedroom. He was 44 years old. The Flavian dynasty, which had brought stability and competence to Rome, ended in violence and suspicion. But it had also established something important: the idea that emperors did not need to be descended from Augustus. They did not need ancient bloodlines. They needed the support of the army, the tolerance of the Senate, and the ability to govern. The next emperor would prove that point even further. When Domitian died, the Senate moved quickly. They needed someone who could restore trust, someone who would not rule through fear. They chose Marcus Coccius Nerva, a respected senator in his 60s with no military background and no heirs. Nerva was 65 years old when he became emperor. He had spent his life in public service, advising emperors, serving in the Senate, and carefully avoiding the dangerous spotlight of power. He was safe, moderate, and unlikely to live long enough to become a tyrant. His reign began with reconciliation. Nerva released those Domitian had imprisoned. He recalled exiles. He promised the Senate that no senator would be executed during his rule, a promise that carried weight after the paranoia of the previous years. But Nerva faced a problem. He had no military experience, and the Praetorian Guard did not respect him. Within months of his accession, the Guard mutinied, demanding that Domitian's assassins be punished. Nerva, powerless to resist, was forced to hand them over. The incident revealed his weakness. Nerva understood that he needed the support of the legions, and to secure that, he needed a successor with military credibility. In AD 97, Nerva adopted Marcus Ulpius Traianus, known as Trajan. Trajan was the governor of Upper Germany, a successful general and a man respected by the armies. He was not related to Nerva by blood, but that did not matter. What mattered was competence. Nerva died in AD 98, just 16 months after becoming emperor. He had ruled briefly, but he had established something crucial: the principle of adoptive succession based on merit rather than birth. It was a principle that would define the next century. Trajan became emperor while still commanding his legions on the Rhine. He did not rush to Rome. He spent months securing the frontier, ensuring the loyalty of his troops, and only then made his way to the capital. When he finally arrived, he entered on foot, greeting senators personally, presenting himself as a soldier emperor who respected the traditions of Rome. The Senate loved him for it. Trajan ruled for 19 years, and they were years of expansion and prosperity. He was the first emperor born outside Italy, coming from the Roman colony of Italica in Hispania. He understood the provinces in a way that earlier emperors had not. He launched campaigns into Dacia, the region north of the Danube, rich in gold and strategically important. The wars were brutal, but successful. Dacia became a Roman province, and the wealth it brought funded massive building projects in Rome. Trajan's Forum, Trajan's Column, Trajan's Market, these structures transformed the city. The Column still stands today, its spiral relief depicting the Dacian Wars in meticulous detail. But Trajan was not content with Dacia. In AD 113, he launched an invasion of Parthia, Rome's great rival in the east. He captured the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon and pushed Roman territory to its greatest extent, reaching the Persian Gulf. It was a stunning achievement, but it could not last. The conquered territories erupted in revolt. Trajan's health began to fail. In AD 117, while returning to Rome, he suffered a stroke and died in the city of Selinus in southern Asia Minor. He was 63 years old. The Senate deified him, one of the few emperors to be genuinely mourned. Before his death, Trajan had adopted Publius Aelius Hadrianus, known as Hadrian, or so it was claimed. The adoption was announced only after Trajan's death, and some suspected that Trajan's wife, Plotina, had arranged it. But whether the adoption was genuine or not, Hadrian had the support of the legions, and that was enough. Hadrian was 41 when he became emperor. He was intelligent, cultured, and deeply interested in Greek philosophy and art. He wore a beard in the Greek style, the first Roman emperor to do so, setting a fashion that would last for generations. But Hadrian was also pragmatic. He immediately recognized that Trajan's eastern conquests were unsustainable. He withdrew from Mesopotamia, abandoned the new provinces, and focused on consolidating what Rome could actually hold. Hadrian spent much of his reign traveling. He visited nearly every province, inspecting defenses, meeting with local leaders, and understanding the empire in a way no emperor had before. He was rarely in Rome, preferring the provinces to the politics of the capital. In Britain, he ordered the construction of a massive wall stretching across the island's narrow neck from coast to coast. Hadrian's Wall marked the northern limit of Roman control, a physical barrier between the empire and the unconquered tribes beyond. Hadrian was also a builder. He reconstructed the Pantheon in Rome, creating the magnificent domed structure that still stands. He built his own villa at Tibur, a sprawling complex of gardens, pools, and pavilions where he could retreat from public life. But Hadrian's personal life was marked by tragedy. He was devoted to a young Greek man named Antinous, who drowned in the Nile in AD 130 under mysterious circumstances. Hadrian's grief was profound. He deified Antinous, founded cities in his name, and commissioned countless statues. It was an open display of emotion unusual for a Roman emperor. Hadrian ruled for 21 years. As he aged, his health declined. He suffered from illness, possibly heart disease, and became increasingly bitter. He executed several senators on suspicion of conspiracy, breaking the promise of safety that had defined the era. In AD 138, knowing he was dying, Hadrian adopted Antoninus, a senator of impeccable reputation and moderate temperament. Hadrian also required Antoninus to adopt two heirs, a young man named Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. It was succession planning on an unprecedented scale. Hadrian died in July of AD 138, at the age of 62. The Senate initially refused to deify him, angry at the executions of his final years. But Antoninus insisted, threatening to refuse the throne unless Hadrian was honored. The Senate relented, and Antoninus earned his title, Pius the Dutiful. Antoninus Pius ruled for 23 years, and they were quiet years. He rarely left Italy, governing the empire from Rome with steady competence. There were no major wars, no dramatic building projects, no crises that threatened the state. It was, in many ways, the most peaceful reign in Roman history. Antoninus was careful with finances, respectful of the Senate, and uninterested in personal glory. He extended Hadrian's Wall further north in Britain, built the Antonine Wall, though it would not hold as long. He managed the provinces well, kept the frontiers secure, and avoided unnecessary conflict. He was not a memorable emperor in the way that Trajan or Hadrian were, but he was effective, and in an empire as vast and complex as Rome, effectiveness was no small achievement. Antoninus died in AD 161 at the age of 74. He had ruled longer than any emperor since Augustus, and when he died, the succession passed smoothly to the two men he had adopted, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. For the first time, Rome had two emperors ruling together. Marcus Aurelius was 40 years old, a philosopher trained in Stoicism, a man who had spent his life preparing for this role. Lucius Verus was 30, charming and capable but less interested in the burdens of governance. They ruled as co-emperors, though Marcus clearly held more authority. Lucius commanded armies in the east, fighting a renewed war with Parthia. Marcus managed the administration, the Senate, and the day-to-day challenges of empire. The partnership worked, but it was tested. A plague swept through the empire, brought back by soldiers returning from the east. It killed millions, weakening the economy and the military. Then came invasions along the Danube frontier, as Germanic tribes pushed into Roman territory. Lucius Verus died in AD 169, possibly from the plague, possibly from a stroke. Marcus Aurelius continued alone. The remaining years of Marcus's reign were spent in almost constant warfare. He campaigned along the Danube, pushing back the invaders, securing the frontier. He lived in military camps, far from the comforts of Rome, writing his philosophical reflections in the quiet moments between battles. Those writings, known as the Meditations, reveal a man struggling with the weight of power, with the gap between Stoic ideals and the brutal realities of ruling an empire. He wrote about duty, about accepting what cannot be changed, about finding peace within oneself even in the midst of chaos. Marcus Aurelius ruled for 19 years. He was the philosopher-emperor, the last of the so-called 5 good emperors. And when he died in AD 180, in a military camp near the Danube, he made a decision that would haunt Rome for generations. He did not adopt an heir based on merit. He passed the throne to his biological son, Commodus. The age of the adoptive emperors was over. Commodus was 19 years old when his father died. He had been raised in the imperial palace, surrounded by luxury and flattery. He had been named co-emperor at the age of 17, given the title of Augustus while Marcus Aurelius still lived. But he had not been shaped by the discipline and philosophy that had defined his father's life. Marcus Aurelius had hoped that his son would grow into the role, that the weight of responsibility would temper him. It did not. Commodus returned to Rome almost immediately after his father's death. The wars along the Danube were not finished, but Commodus had no interest in continuing them. He made peace with the Germanic tribes, granting them favorable terms, and left the frontier. The early years of his reign were managed by capable advisors, men who had served Marcus Aurelius and who tried to guide the young emperor. But Commodus resented their control. One by one he removed them, replacing experienced administrators with favorites who told him what he wanted to hear. Commodus became obsessed with gladiatorial combat. He did not simply watch the games, he participated in them. He fought in the arena, dressed as Hercules, killing animals and occasionally fighting human opponents who were given blunted weapons or were already wounded. He saw himself as a reincarnation of Hercules, a divine warrior. The Senate was horrified. The people were entertained but uneasy. And the empire's administration began to crumble as Commodus focused on spectacle rather than governance. There were conspiracies against him. His own sister, Lucilla, plotted his assassination in AD 182, but the attempt failed. Commodus responded with paranoia and purges. Senators were executed. Officials were removed. Trust disappeared. By AD 192, even those closest to Commodus had turned against him. On the last day of the year, he was strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, part of a conspiracy that included his mistress and the Praetorian prefect. Commodus had ruled for 12 years. He was 31 years old, and with his death, the stability of the 5 good emperors collapsed entirely. The Senate moved quickly, declaring Publius Helvius Pertinax as emperor. Pertinax was 66 years old, a senator of common birth who had risen through military service. He was competent, disciplined, and determined to restore order. But Pertinax made the same mistake as Galba more than a century before. He tried to impose austerity on an empire that had grown used to excess. He cut spending, refused to pay the bonuses the Praetorian Guard expected, and attempted to restore discipline to a military that had been indulged under Commodus. The Praetorians tolerated him for 86 days. Then, in March of AD 193, a group of guardsmen broke into the palace and murdered him. What followed was unprecedented. The Praetorian Guard announced that the imperial throne was for sale. They would auction it to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Marcus Didius Julianus won. He promised enormous sums to the Guard, more than the treasury could afford, more than any emperor had ever paid. The Praetorians declared him emperor, and Julianus entered the palace believing he had secured power. He had not. The legions in the provinces were outraged. 3 different generals declared themselves emperor, each backed by their own armies. Civil war erupted once again. Julianus ruled for 66 days. In June of AD 193, as the legions of Septimius Severus approached Rome, the Senate declared Julianus an enemy of the state. He was abandoned by the Praetorians and executed in the palace. Septimius Severus entered Rome as the 4th emperor of the year. He was 47 years old, born in North Africa, and a career military commander. He understood that power came from the legions, and he acted accordingly. Severus disbanded the Praetorian Guard that had murdered Pertinax and auctioned the throne. He replaced them with soldiers from his own legions, men loyal to him personally. It was a clear message. The emperor's power rested on military strength, not on the approval of the Senate or the people of Rome. But Severus still had rivals. Pescennius Niger controlled the eastern provinces. Clodius Albinus commanded the legions in Britain. Severus defeated Niger first, then turned west and crushed Albinus in a brutal battle near Lugdunum in Gaul. By AD 197, Severus stood alone. He ruled for 18 years, and they were years of military expansion and authoritarian control. He campaigned in Mesopotamia, briefly capturing the Parthian capital again. He strengthened the frontiers, increased the size of the army, and raised soldiers' pay, but he also centralized power, reducing the Senate's influence and relying on a bureaucracy staffed by equestrians and freedmen. He famously advised his sons, "Enrich the soldiers and scorn all others." Severus died in AD 211 in Eboracum, modern-day York, while campaigning in Britain. He was 65 years old. He left the empire to his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, with instructions that they rule together. They did not. Within a year, Caracalla had Geta murdered in their mother's arms. He then ordered the execution of anyone who had supported his brother, killing thousands. Caracalla ruled alone for 6 years. He was brutal, paranoid, and obsessed with military glory. He saw himself as a new Alexander the Great and dressed in Macedonian style. He raised soldiers' pay again, further straining the treasury. In AD 212, Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. It was a sweeping reform, though likely motivated more by the desire to increase tax revenue than by any sense of equality. Caracalla spent most of his reign on campaign, fighting in Germany and then in the east against Parthia. In AD 217, while traveling in Mesopotamia, he was assassinated by one of his own soldiers, possibly at the instigation of the Praetorian prefect, Macrinus. Macrinus declared himself emperor, the first man to hold the title without being a senator. But his reign lasted only 14 months. The Severan family was not finished. Julia Domna, the widow of Septimius Severus, had died shortly after Caracalla. But her sister, Julia Maesa, remained influential and wealthy. She had 2 grandsons, and she was determined to see one of them become emperor. In AD 218, the legions in Syria declared Maesa's elder grandson, Elagabalus, as emperor. He was 14 years old, a priest of the sun god Elagabal in the Syrian city of Emesa. Macrinus was defeated and killed. Elagabalus entered Rome. His reign was chaos. Elagabalus brought his religious practices to Rome, installing a black stone representing his god in a temple on the Palatine Hill. He married and divorced multiple times, including a Vestal virgin, violating one of Rome's most sacred traditions. He, dressed in silk and makeup, behaved in ways that shocked even a city used to eccentric emperors. The Senate despised him. The people mocked him. And Julia Maesa, realizing her mistake, began to shift support to her younger grandson, Severus Alexander. In AD 222, the Praetorian Guard murdered Elagabalus and his mother. Their bodies were dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber. Elagabalus had ruled for less than 4 years. He was 18 years old. Severus Alexander became emperor at the age of 13. He was guided by his grandmother, Julia Maesa, and later by his mother, Julia Mamaea. For a time, the empire was stable. Alexander was respectful of the Senate, moderate in his policies, and willing to listen to advisers. But he was also weak. He could not control his mother, who dominated the court. And when military crises arose, he proved unable to lead. In AD 235, while campaigning against Germanic tribes along the Rhine, the legions mutinied. They were tired of an emperor who seemed more interested in negotiation than victory, tired of being controlled by women in the palace. The soldiers murdered Severus Alexander and his mother in their tent. He was 26 years old. The Severan dynasty, which had ruled for more than 40 years, was over, and Rome entered its darkest period yet. The death of Severus Alexander marked the beginning of a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. It lasted 50 years, and during that time, the empire nearly collapsed. Between AD 235 and AD 284, Rome had more than 50 emperors. Most ruled for only a few months or years. Most died violently. The throne became a prize seized by whoever commanded the strongest army, and armies were everywhere, fighting each other as often as they fought Rome's enemies. The first of these soldier emperors was Maximinus Thrax, the man whose troops had killed Severus Alexander. Maximinus was a Thracian of humble birth, possibly the son of a peasant. He had risen through the ranks purely through military ability. He was enormous, reportedly over 7 feet tall, and known for his physical strength. Maximinus never set foot in Rome as emperor. He spent his entire reign on the frontiers, campaigning in Germany and along the Danube. He raised taxes to pay his soldiers, confiscated wealth from the Senate, and ruled through intimidation. The Senate hated him. In AD 238, they declared 2 of their own members, Pupienus and Balbinus, as co-emperors. At the same time, a revolt broke out in North Africa, where the elderly governor Gordian and his son were proclaimed emperors by their troops. The year AD 238 became known as the Year of the 6 Emperors. Gordian and his son were killed within weeks. Maximinus marched on Italy to crush the Senate's rebellion, but was murdered by his own soldiers outside the city of Aquileia. Pupienus and Balbinus ruled together for 99 days before the Praetorian Guard killed them both. The throne passed to Gordian III, the 13-year-old grandson of the first Gordian. He ruled for 6 years, guided by advisers and generals. He campaigned in the east against the new Sassanid Persian Empire, which had replaced the Parthians and proved far more dangerous. In AD 244, Gordian died in Mesopotamia, possibly killed in battle, possibly murdered by his own Praetorian prefect, Philip. Philip the Arab, as he became known, declared himself emperor. He was from the Arabian provinces, another sign of how far the empire had moved from its Italian roots. Philip ruled for 5 years. He celebrated Rome's 1000th anniversary in AD 248 with elaborate games and festivals, a brief moment of unity in an age of chaos. but the frontiers were crumbling. Germanic tribes raided across the Rhine and Danube. The Sassanids pressed from the east, and the legions, stretched thin and poorly supplied, grew restless. In A.D. 249, the legions on the Danube declared their commander, Decius, as emperor. Philip marched to meet him and was killed in battle. Decius became emperor and immediately faced a crisis worse than any before. The Goths, a Germanic people, invaded across the Danube in massive numbers. Decius fought them for 2 years, but in A.D. 251, he and his son were killed in battle at Abritus. It was the first time a Roman emperor had died fighting barbarians. Decius was followed by Trebonianus Gallus, who ruled for 2 years before being killed by his own troops. Then came Aemilianus, who lasted 3 months. Then Valerian, who ruled jointly with his son Gallienus. Valerian campaigned in the east against the Sassanids. In A.D. 260, he was captured in battle by the Persian king Shapur I. It was an unprecedented humiliation. Valerian spent the rest of his life in captivity, possibly used as a footstool by the Persian king. He never returned to Rome. Gallienus ruled alone for another 8 years. He faced invasions on every frontier, usurpers in nearly every province, and an empire that seemed to be tearing itself apart. Gaul, Britain, and Spain broke away, forming the Gallic Empire under their own emperors. In the east, the city of Palmyra became a power unto itself under Queen Zenobia. Gallienus did what he could. He reformed the army, creating mobile cavalry units that could respond quickly to threats. He abandoned provinces that could not be held. He fought constantly, moving from one crisis to another. In A.D. 268, his own officers assassinated him during a siege in northern Italy. He had ruled for 15 years, longer than most emperors of this era, but he left an empire fractured and bleeding. Claudius II, called Gothicus, succeeded him. Claudius won a major victory against the Goths, driving them back across the Danube and earning his nickname. But in A.D. 270, he died of plague. He had ruled for 2 years. The throne passed to Aurelian, a soldier from the Danube provinces. Aurelian was ruthless, brilliant, and determined to restore the empire by force. He defeated the Goths. He reconquered the breakaway territories in the east, defeating Zenobia and bringing Palmyra back under Roman control. He marched west and reclaimed Gaul, Britain, and Spain from the Gallic Empire. In just 5 years, he reunited the Roman world. Aurelian also built new walls around Rome itself, a massive, defensive circuit that still stands today. It was an admission that even the capital was no longer safe, that the empire could no longer protect its heartland without fortifications. But Aurelian's methods made enemies. In A.D. 275, while campaigning in the east, he was assassinated by his own officers, possibly over a misunderstanding, possibly as part of a conspiracy. He was followed by Tacitus, an elderly senator who ruled for 6 months before dying, possibly of natural causes, possibly murdered. Then came Florian, who lasted 3 months before being killed by his troops. Then Probus, another soldier emperor who ruled for 6 years, won victories on the frontiers, and was killed by his own men in A.D. 282, when he tried to put them to work on civilian projects during peacetime. Then Carus, who ruled for 1 year and died mysteriously while campaigning in Persia, possibly struck by lightning, possibly assassinated. Carus's sons, Carinus and Numerian, ruled briefly and chaotically. Numerian died under suspicious circumstances in A.D. 284. Carinus was killed by his own troops in A.D. 285. And then, finally, the crisis found its end. The legions in the east declared their commander, Diocles, as emperor. He was a soldier from Dalmatia, a man of low birth and high competence. He took the name Diocletian, and he would change everything. Diocletian understood that the empire could not continue as it had. 50 years of chaos had proven that one man, no matter how capable, could not defend every frontier, manage every province, and respond to every crisis. The empire was too large, the threats were too many, and the system of succession, where emperors were made and unmade by armies, had to end. Diocletian's solution was radical. He would divide the empire, not to weaken it, but to make it governable. In AD 286, just 1 year after securing his position, Diocletian appointed a co-emperor. His name was Maximian, a fellow soldier from the Balkans. Diocletian took the title Augustus and ruled the eastern provinces from Nicomedia in Asia Minor. Maximian, also given the title Augustus, ruled the west from Milan. It was not a division of the empire into two separate states. It was a division of responsibility. Both men were emperors, but Diocletian held seniority. He was the senior Augustus, the architect of the system. But Diocletian went further. In AD 293, he expanded the system again. Each Augustus appointed a junior emperor, a Caesar, who would govern a portion of the empire and eventually succeed to the rank of Augustus. Diocletian chose Galerius as his Caesar. Maximian chose Constantius, called Chlorus the Pale. The empire now had 4 rulers, each responsible for a quarter of the Roman world. Historians call this system the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. It was an elegant solution, at least in theory. The empire could respond to multiple threats simultaneously. Succession would be orderly, with Caesars rising to become Augusti and appointing new Caesars in turn. And no single man would bear the impossible burden of ruling alone. Diocletian also reformed the administration. He divided provinces into smaller units, making them easier to govern and harder for ambitious governors to use as power bases. He separated civil and military authority so that no provincial governor commanded legions. He expanded the bureaucracy, creating a vast network of officials to manage taxation, supply, and communication. He reformed the army, increasing its size and creating mobile field armies that could move quickly to threatened frontiers. He built new fortifications, strengthened existing ones, and established a defense in depth that could absorb invasions without collapsing. And he tried to stabilize the economy. Decades of war and debasement had destroyed the currency. Prices had spiraled out of control. Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices, attempting to fix the cost of goods and services throughout the empire. It was ambitious, but ultimately unenforceable. The economy was too complex, too interconnected, for simple price controls to work. Diocletian also launched the last great persecution of Christians. In AD 303, he issued edicts ordering the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the arrest of Christian clergy. The persecution was severe in the East, less so in the West, where Constantius largely ignored the orders. It would be the final attempt to suppress Christianity through force. Diocletian ruled for 20 years. He campaigned in Egypt, in Persia, along the Danube. He stabilized the frontiers, restored order, and gave the empire a structure that could survive. And then, in AD 305, he did something no emperor had done before. He abdicated. Diocletian stepped down voluntarily, retiring to a palace he had built in Spalatum, modern-day Split in Croatia. He forced Maximian to abdicate as well, though Maximian did so reluctantly. The two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, became Augusti. New Caesars were appointed, Severus in the west, Maximinus Daia in the east. The Tetrarchy was supposed to continue smoothly. It did not. Constantius died in AD 306, just 1 year after becoming Augustus. He was in Britain, campaigning against the Picts when illness took him. His son Constantine was with him, and the legions in. Britain immediately declared Constantine as Augustus. But Constantine was not the designated Caesar. That position belonged to Severus. The system Diocletian had created was already breaking down. In Rome, the Praetorian Guard declared Maxentius, the son of the retired Maximian, as emperor. Maximian himself came out of retirement to support his son. In the east, Galerius tried to hold the system together, but he faced challenges from Maximinus Daia, who wanted more power, and from Licinius, another general with imperial ambitions. By AD 308, there were 6 men claiming to be Augustus. The Tetrarchy had collapsed into civil war. Diocletian was asked to return, to restore order as he had before. He refused. He was living quietly in his palace, growing cabbages, and he had no interest in returning to the chaos of imperial politics. He died in AD 311, possibly by his own hand, having seen his carefully constructed system fall apart. But the structure he had created, the division of the empire, the reformed administration, the strengthened military, would survive, and one man would emerge from the civil wars to reshape the empire once more. His name was Constantine. Constantine was in his early 30s when his father died in Britain. He had spent years at the courts of Diocletian and Galerius, essentially a hostage to ensure his father's loyalty. He had seen how the Tetrarchy worked, and he had seen its weaknesses. When the legions in Britain declared him Augustus, Constantine accepted. But he was pragmatic. He knew he could not hold the entire West alone, not against the other claimants. So he initially took only the title of Caesar, acknowledging Galerius as Senior Augustus. It was a temporary compromise. Constantine had larger ambitions. In Rome, Maxentius ruled as a tyrant. He had the support of the Praetorian Guard and the city's population, but he was hated by the Senate and feared by the provinces. He did not venture far from Italy, content to hold the heartland while others fought over the rest. By AD 312, Constantine controlled Gaul and Britain. He had defeated Maximian, who had tried to reclaim power, and he had secured his position in the west. Now he turned his attention to Italy. Constantine marched south with an army smaller than Maxentius's forces, but more experienced and better led. The two armies met at the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome, on October 28, AD 312. What happened before the battle became one of the most famous stories in Christian history. Constantine claimed he saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol, the Chi Rho, on their shields. Whether the vision was real, whether it was a dream, or whether it was a later invention, Constantine won the battle. Maxentius's army was routed. Maxentius himself drowned in the Tiber, weighed down by his armor. Constantine entered Rome as the undisputed master of the West, and he attributed his victory to the Christian God. Constantine did not immediately convert to Christianity. He continued to honor traditional Roman gods in public, but he began to favor Christians, ending the persecutions, returning confiscated property, and granting the church legal privileges. In AD 313, Constantine met with Licinius, who controlled the eastern provinces in Milan. Together, they issued what became known as the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire. Christians could worship freely. Churches could own property. The age of persecution was over. But Constantine and Licinius were rivals, not partners. They fought 2 civil wars in AD 316 and again in AD 324. Constantine won both. Licinius was captured, promised his life, and then executed. By AD 324, Constantine ruled the entire Roman Empire alone. He was the first emperor to do so since the Tetrarchy began, and he would be one of the last. Constantine made decisions that would reshape the empire for centuries. He continued Diocletian's administrative reforms, but he also reversed some of them. He reunited civil and military authority in some provinces. He created a new mobile field army, the comitatenses, that could respond to threats anywhere in the empire. He reformed the currency, introducing the solidus, a gold coin that would remain stable for centuries. He built churches, including the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And in AD 330, he founded a new capital. The city of Byzantium, on the Bosporus Strait between Europe and Asia, was ancient and strategically located. Constantine chose it as the site for a new Rome, a Christian capital for a changing empire. He renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was built on a grand scale, with forums, palaces, churches, and a hippodrome for chariot races. It had its own senate, its own grain supply, and all the trappings of imperial power. Constantine intended it to rival Rome itself, and in time it would surpass it. Constantine ruled for 31 years. He was baptized as a Christian only on his deathbed in AD 337 at the age of 64. He died in a villa near Nicomedia, having transformed the empire in ways that Diocletian could never have imagined. He left the empire to his 3 sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. He also left nephews and other relatives with claims to power. It was a recipe for conflict. Within months of Constantine's death, the army purged most of the extended family, killing potential rivals. The 3 sons divided the empire among themselves. Constantine II took the west, Constans took Italy and Africa, and Constantius II took the east. It lasted 3 years. In AD 340, Constantine II invaded Italy and was killed in battle. Constans took his territories, ruling the entire west. But Constans was unpopular, seen as weak and indulgent. In AD 350, he was overthrown and killed by a usurper named Magnantius. Constantius II, the last surviving son of Constantine, defeated Magnantius in a series of brutal battles. By AD 353, he ruled alone, as his father had. Constantius was a devout Christian, but he favored Arianism, a theological position that denied the full divinity of Christ. He persecuted those who disagreed, exiling bishops and closing churches. The empire, now officially Christian, was tearing itself apart over doctrine. Constantius ruled for 24 years, longer than either of his brothers. He spent much of that time fighting Persia in the east and managing usurpers in the west. In AD 361, while marching to confront yet another rival, he fell ill and died. He was 44 years old. The rival he had been marching against was his own cousin, Julian. Julian became emperor at the age of 29. He had been raised Christian, educated in philosophy, and given military command by Constantius. But Julian had secretly abandoned Christianity, returning to the old gods of Rome. When he became emperor, he made his beliefs public. He reopened pagan temples, restored their funding, and tried to revive traditional Roman religion. Christians called him Julian the Apostate. Julian was intelligent, energetic, and idealistic. He believed he could turn back the tide, that he could restore the empire to its pre-Christian glory. He wrote philosophical treatises, reformed the administration, and lived simply, rejecting the luxuries of the palace. In AD 363, he launched an invasion of Persia, hoping to succeed where so many emperors had failed. The campaign went well at first, but then Julian was wounded in a skirmish. The wound became infected. He died in his tent, far from Rome, at the age of 31. He had ruled for less than 2 years, and with his death, the last attempt to restore paganism died as well. The army chose Jovian, a Christian officer, as emperor. Jovian made peace with Persia, ceding territory to secure the army's safe return. He ruled for 8 months before dying, possibly from accidental carbon monoxide poisoning in an overheated room. The empire needed stability. It needed someone who could hold the East and West together. It found that person in Valentinian, a soldier from Pannonia. Valentinian became emperor in AD 364. Almost immediately, he appointed his brother Valens as co-emperor, giving him the East while Valentinian ruled the West. It was a return to the divided administration of Diocletian, but this time the division would become permanent. The Roman Empire was splitting in two. Valentinian ruled the West from Milan. His brother Valens ruled the East from Constantinople. They were the first emperors to formalize what had been growing inevitable. The Roman Empire was becoming two empires, sharing a name and a history, but governed separately. Valentinian was a capable soldier and administrator. He strengthened the Rhine frontier, building fortifications and repelling Germanic invasions. He was stern, sometimes brutal, but effective. He ruled for 11 years before dying of a stroke in AD 375, reportedly brought on by rage during a meeting with barbarian envoys. He left 2 sons, Gratian, who was 16 and had already been named co-emperor, and Valentinian II, who was only 4 years old. The West was divided between them, with Gratian holding the larger share. In the East, Valens faced a crisis that would change everything. The Goths, a Germanic people who had lived beyond the Danube for generations, were being pushed westward by the Huns, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia. In AD 376, Gothic refugees appeared at the empire's borders, tens of thousands of them, asking for permission to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory. Valens agreed. It seemed like an opportunity. The Goths could be settled on empty land, taxed, and recruited into the army. But the Roman officials who managed the resettlement were corrupt. They extorted the refugees, sold them spoiled food at inflated prices, and treated them with contempt. The Goths rebelled. In AD 378, Valens marched to confront them with an army drawn from the eastern provinces. The two forces met at Adrianople in Thrace. The Battle of Adrianople was a catastrophe. The Roman army was destroyed. Valens himself was killed, though his body was never found. It was the worst Roman defeat since Cannae, more than 500 years earlier. The Goths were now inside the empire, undefeated and dangerous. The East needed an emperor, and Gratian, ruling in the West, chose Theodosius, a Spanish general whose father had served Valentinian. Theodosius became emperor of the East in AD 379. He was 33 years old, and he inherited a crisis. The Goths were raiding through the Balkans. The army was shattered. The provinces were in chaos. Theodosius could not defeat the Goths militarily, so he negotiated. In AD 382, he made a treaty allowing the Goths to settle within the empire as federates, semi-autonomous allies who would provide soldiers in exchange for land. It was a pragmatic solution, but it set a precedent. Barbarian peoples could now live within the empire, keeping their own leaders and laws. Theodosius was also a devout Christian, and he made Christianity the official religion of the empire. In AD 380, he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Nicene Christianity the only legitimate faith. Pagan temples were closed. Pagan practices were banned. The old gods of Rome were officially dead. In AD 383, Gratian was assassinated by a usurper named Magnus Maximus in Gaul. Theodosius initially recognized Maximus, but when Maximus invaded Italy in AD 387, threatening the young Valentinian the Saint, Theodosius marched west and defeated him. Valentinian II was restored, but he was a puppet. Real power in the west lay with Theodosius. In AD 392, Valentinian died under mysterious circumstances, possibly suicide, possibly murder. Theodosius marched west again, this time to defeat another usurper, Eugenius, who had tried to restore paganism. By AD 394, Theodosius ruled both east and west, the last emperor to do so, but he was aging and ill. In AD 395, he died in Milan at the age of 48. He left the empire to his two sons. Arcadius, 18 years old, became emperor of the East. Honorius, 10 years old, became emperor of the West. The division was now permanent. The Roman Empire had become the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. They would never be reunited. Arcadius ruled the East from Constantinople. He was weak, dominated by advisors and court officials. His reign was marked by political intrigue, religious controversy, and the growing power of the Church. But the East was wealthy, defensible, and relatively stable. Constantinople was far from the barbarian invasions that plagued the West. Arcadius ruled for 13 years, dying in AD 408 at the age of 31. His son, Theodosius II, became emperor at the age of 7. Theodosius II would rule for 42 years, one of the longest reigns in Roman history, though much of that time he was controlled by his sister Pulcheria, and later by his wife Eudocia. The East would survive. It would endure for another 1,000 years, transforming into what historians call the Byzantine Empire, though its people always called themselves Romans. But the West was collapsing. Honorius ruled from Ravenna, a city on the Adriatic coast that was easier to defend than Rome or Milan. He was controlled by his general, Stilicho, a man of Vandal descent who was the real power in the West. Stilicho fought to hold the frontiers, but the pressure was relentless. In AD 406, a massive wave of barbarian peoples crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul. Vandals, Alans, Suevi, they poured into the provinces, and there were not enough troops to stop them. In AD 408, Honorius had Stilicho executed, possibly fearing his power, possibly manipulated by court rivals. It was a catastrophic mistake. Without Stilicho, the West had no effective military leadership. In AD 410, Alaric, king of the Visigoths, sacked Rome. It was the first time the city had fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years. The shock reverberated throughout the empire. Rome, the eternal city, had been violated. Honorius, safe in Ravenna, reportedly cared more about his pet chickens than the fall of Rome. He ruled for 28 years, dying in AD 423 at the age of 38. He left no heirs. The West staggered on, but it was dying. Emperors came and went. most of them puppets controlled by barbarian generals or powerful aristocrats. The provinces were being carved up by Gothic, Vandal, and Frankish kingdoms. The army was increasingly composed of barbarian federates who owed loyalty to their own leaders, not to Rome. The end was coming. After Honorius died in AD 423, the Western throne passed to Valentinian III, the son of Honorius's half-sister. He was 6 years old. Valentinian III ruled for 30 years, but he never truly ruled. His mother, Galla Placidia, controlled the government during his youth. Later, his general Aetius became the real power in the West. Aetius was the last great Roman general. He spent decades fighting to preserve what remained of the Western Empire, using diplomacy and military force in equal measure. He played barbarian kingdoms against each other, recruited Huns as mercenaries, and won victories that briefly stabilized the frontiers. In AD 451, Attila the Hun invaded Gaul with a massive army. Aetius assembled a coalition of Romans, Visigoths, and other barbarian peoples. They met Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, and though the battle was inconclusive, Attila withdrew. The following year, Attila invaded Italy, but turned back before reaching Rome, possibly due to disease. In his army, possibly due to negotiations with Pope Leo I, Attila died in AD 453, and the Hunnic threat collapsed. But Valentinian, jealous of Aetius's power and influence, personally murdered him in AD 454. It was an act of staggering foolishness. Without Aetius, the West had no one capable of defending it. Valentinian himself was assassinated the following year, in AD 455, by supporters of Aetius seeking revenge. He was 36 years old. The Vandals, who had crossed into North Africa decades earlier and established a kingdom there, sailed to Italy and sacked Rome. It was the second time in half a century that the Eternal City had fallen. After Valentinian, the Western emperors became shadows. They were appointed by barbarian generals, by the Senate, or by the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. They ruled from Ravenna, if they ruled at all. Most lasted only a few years, some only months. Petronius Maximus ruled for 75 days before being killed by a mob during the Vandal sack of Rome. Avitus ruled for 14 months before being deposed. Majorian ruled for 4 years and tried to restore the empire's strength, but he was betrayed and executed by his own general, Ricimer. Ricimer was a barbarian of Gothic and Suevic descent. He was the Magister Militum, the master of soldiers, and for 16 years he was the true power in the West. He made and unmade emperors at will: Libius Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius. They were his puppets, ruling only as long as Ricimer allowed. Ricimer died in AD 472, and the West continued its collapse. Glycerius ruled for 1 year before being deposed. Julius Nepos ruled for 2 years, recognized by Constantinople as the legitimate emperor, but he was driven from Italy by his own general, Orestes. Orestes did not claim the throne for himself. Instead, in AD 475, he placed his teenage son on the throne. The boy's name was Romulus, and he was given the nickname Augustulus, Little Augustus. Romulus Augustulus was 14 or 15 years old. He had no real power. His father, Orestes, governed in his name, but even Orestes could not hold the West together. In AD 476, the barbarian Foederati in Italy, led by a general named Odoacer, rebelled. They demanded land and payment. When Orestes refused, they killed him and marched on Ravenna. Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus on September 4th, AD 476, but he did not kill the boy. He pensioned him off, sending him to live in a villa in Campania with a generous allowance. Romulus disappeared from history, his fate unknown. Odoacer did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, the symbols of Roman authority, to Constantinople. He declared that the West no longer needed its own emperor, that the emperor in the East could rule both halves of the empire in name, while Odoacer governed Italy as his representative. It was a polite fiction. In reality, the Western Roman Empire had ended. Julius, Nepos, still in exile in Dalmatia, continued to claim the title of Western Emperor until his assassination in AD 480. Some historians consider him the last legitimate emperor of the West. But by then it hardly mattered. The western provinces had become barbarian kingdoms. The Visigoths ruled Spain and southern Gaul. The Vandals ruled North Africa. The Franks ruled northern Gaul. The Burgundians, the Suevi, the Ostrogoths. They carved up what had been the Roman West. Rome itself became just another city, ruled by Odoacer, and later by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric. The Senate still met. Latin was still spoken. Roman law was still respected. But the empire was gone. In the East, the emperors in Constantinople continued to call themselves Roman. They would rule for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman identity. But they ruled in Greek, from a Greek city, over an increasingly Greek world. The line of emperors that began with Augustus in 27 BC ended with Romulus Augustulus in AD 476. It had lasted 500 years. 88 emperors, by most counts, though the number varies depending on how you count usurpers and co-emperors. Some ruled for decades, some for days. Some were remembered as great, most were forgotten. But together, they shaped a civilization that influenced the world for centuries after its fall. 500 years is a long time to hold anything together. Empires rise because people believe in them. They fall when that belief fades, when the structures that hold them become too heavy to carry, when the distance between what they were and what they have become grows too wide to bridge. Rome began with Augustus, a man who promised peace after decades of civil war. It ended with Romulus Augustulus, a boy who held a title that no longer meant anything. Between them stretched centuries of conquest and retreat, of glory and decay, of emperors who shaped the world and emperors whose names are barely remembered. Some of those emperors were wise. Marcus Aurelius wrote philosophy while defending the frontiers. Hadrian traveled the empire, understanding its vastness and its limits. Trajan expanded Rome to its greatest extent, bringing wealth and prestige. Others were cruel. Caligula and Nero became symbols of tyranny. Commodus turned the throne into a stage for his own vanity. Elagabalus shocked even a city used to excess. Most were simply men trying to manage an impossible task. They inherited an empire too large to govern, too diverse to unite, too complex to reform. They did what they could with the tools they had, and when they failed, others took their place. The pattern repeated across the centuries. An emperor would rise, often through violence. He would try to stabilize the frontiers, manage the economy, balance the demands of the army and the Senate. He would build monuments, win victories, make reforms. And then he would die, often violently, and the cycle would begin again. The empire changed slowly, then all at once. It grew from a Mediterranean power to a world-spanning colossus. It adopted Christianity, transforming from a pagan state to a Christian one. It divided into East and West, two empires sharing a name but following different paths. The East survived. Constantinople stood for 1,000 years after Rome fell, preserving Roman law, Roman administration, and the idea of Rome itself. The emperors in Constantinople called themselves Roman until the very end, until the Ottoman conquest in 453. But the West collapsed, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually as provinces were lost, as barbarian kingdoms replaced Roman administration, as the idea of a unified empire became a memory rather than a reality. Romulus Augustulus was not killed. He was pensioned off, allowed to live quietly in retirement. It was a gentle end to something that had lasted so long. No final battle, no dramatic last stand. Just a boy emperor stepping down, and the realization that no one would replace him. The imperial regalia was sent to Constantinople. The Senate continued to meet in Rome. Latin was still spoken. Roman law was still studied. But the line of emperors, the unbroken succession from Augustus to Romulus Augustulus, was over. What remains is memory. The names of emperors carved in stone, written in histories, preserved in coins and inscriptions. The buildings they constructed, some still standing, some reduced to ruins. The laws they codified, which influenced legal systems for centuries. The roads they built, which connected a world, and the idea of Rome itself. The idea that a single state could unite diverse peoples, that law could replace chaos, that civilization could be built and maintained across generations. That idea outlasted the emperors. It outlasted the empire. It shaped kingdoms and nations that came after, each claiming to be Rome's heir, each trying to capture something of what Rome had been. But Rome, the Rome of the emperors, is gone. It exists now only in the past, in the long timeline of names and reigns, of rises and falls, of human ambition and human failure. This has been that timeline. Every emperor from Augustus to Romulus Augustulus. 500 years compressed into a few hours. A story of power and its limits, of glory and its cost, of an empire that lasted longer than most but could not last forever. If you've listened this far, thank you. If you drifted off along the way, that's perfectly fine. Rome will still be here, in memory, in history, in the quiet knowledge that even the greatest empires are, in the end, just collections of human lives. This is Archive of Rest. And now you can rest too.